Every child learns their first language in a way that seems almost miraculous. No one sits a 3-year-old down with a grammar workbook. No one begins by explaining verb tenses, sentence structure, or pronunciation rules. Children are not handed vocabulary lists and told to memorize them before they are allowed to speak. And yet, by the age of 5, most of them can already understand thousands of words, respond naturally, express emotions, ask questions, and carry on simple conversations with surprising ease. That fact alone should make us stop and think, because something extremely important is happening in those early years, and most adult language learning methods ignore it almost completely. When adults decide to learn a new language, they usually begin in the exact opposite way. They buy a textbook. They open to chapter 1. They start memorizing greetings, common expressions, and isolated vocabulary words. Then they move on to conjugation charts, grammar exercises, and repetition drills. Day after day, they study rules about the language instead of actually experiencing it. And even after months, sometimes even years, many of them still cannot hold a simple, relaxed conversation in real life. Why does this happen? Because they are trying to learn a language the same way someone might try to learn carpentry by memorizing the names of tools without ever building anything. They know what a hammer is called. They know what a saw is called. They may even remember the technical names of parts and methods. But knowing the names of the tools does not mean they know how to build a chair. Language works the same way. The central mistake most people make is assuming that language is a body of information to store. They treat it like history facts, chemistry formulas, or exam content. They assume that if they can collect enough words, enough grammar rules, and enough correct translations, fluency will eventually appear on its own. But language is not a pile of facts. It is a living system. It is a pattern-based way of representing reality. It is something the brain uses, not something the brain simply stores, and that difference changes everything. A textbook usually presents language as a sequence of items to memorize. Hello, goodbye, my name is, where is the bathroom? The student writes them down, repeats them, maybe highlights them, maybe tests themselves on them. Then chapter 2 adds more phrases and introduces a few grammar rules, then another chapter, and another. The process becomes memorize, drill, test, move on. It feels productive, it feels organized, it feels like learning. But in many cases, it is only the appearance of learning, because knowing about a language is not the same as being able to use it. Those are two very different abilities. A person can explain grammar rules perfectly and still panic when asked a simple question at a cafe. They can recognize dozens of vocabulary words on paper and still be unable to form a sentence when speaking. They can pass written tests and still freeze in a real conversation. That is because knowledge about language and the ability to use language do not live in the mind in the same way. One is stored as explanation, the other is built as instinct. And what makes children so powerful as learners is not that they study harder. It is that they do not begin with explanation. They begin with contact, use, experimentation, and response. They absorb patterns long before they can describe them. They become fluent in structure before they ever learn terminology. That is the profound truth most courses miss. The real problem is not that adults are bad at learning languages. The problem is that adults are usually taught in a way that fights against how the brain naturally learns them. So the first lesson of this content is simple but powerful. If you want to learn a language well, you must stop thinking of it as information to memorize and start seeing it as a system to experience, explore, and use. If the old method fails, then the next question becomes unavoidable. How does the brain actually learn a language? To understand that, we should stop looking at classrooms for a moment and start looking at children. A 5-year-old does not know what a verb is. A child cannot explain grammar rules, sentence structure, or subject-verb agreement. Yet that same child can often use language naturally, correctly, and with very little hesitation. That alone tells us something important. The brain is clearly capable of building language ability before it can explain language theory. So what is the child doing? The child is not studying language as information. The child is playing with it. They hear sounds, repeat them, test them, and notice what happens. Sometimes they say something wrong and get corrected. Sometimes the reaction on someone's face tells them it did not work. Sometimes they hear the same pattern again and again until it begins to feel natural. Through thousands of these tiny experiments, the brain starts building something far more powerful than memorized knowledge. It builds intuition. That is the real foundation of language learning. Most adults lose this instinctive approach. Instead of experimenting, they try to prepare. They believe they must understand the rules first, memorize enough vocabulary first, and feel ready first. So they delay real interaction with the language. They keep collecting information, hoping ability will appear later as a result of all that preparation. But the brain does not build fluency by waiting. It builds fluency by engaging. This is where the method in the text becomes so powerful. It works with the brain's natural learning process instead of against it. The method is simple. Take any piece of writing in the language you want to learn. It can be a children's story, a short article, a blog post, or anything else. The important thing is that it should be something you are genuinely curious about. Curiosity matters because the brain pays more attention to what feels meaningful. Interest sharpens focus. It makes the mind more active, more alert, and more willing to wrestle with uncertainty. Now comes the step that changes everything. Do not immediately look up every unknown word. Instead, read the passage and try to guess what it means, not blindly but intelligently. Use every clue available. Maybe you recognize a few familiar words. Maybe the sentence structure suggests a pattern. Maybe the context gives you a direction. Maybe one word repeats often enough that its role becomes clearer. Whatever clues you have, use them to form a hypothesis. Then check whether you were right. This order is crucial. Most people think the learning happens when they receive the correct answer, but that is only half true. The deeper learning happens when the brain first makes a prediction and then compares that prediction with reality. That gap between expectation and truth is where real adaptation begins. The brain is not just a container for storing facts, it is a prediction machine. It is always trying to anticipate meaning, patterns, and outcomes. When it predicts correctly, the pattern grows stronger. When it predicts incorrectly, the brain is forced to update its internal model. That update is learning. This is why memorizing vocabulary lists feels so weak for so many people. You are feeding the brain answers to questions it never had to ask. There is no struggle, no prediction, no tension, and therefore very little real learning. The information may stay in short-term memory for a while, but because it was never connected to active discovery, it usually fades quickly. But when you struggle with a sentence, make your best guess, and then test that guess, the brain becomes deeply involved. Now, language is no longer something you are passively receiving. It becomes something you are actively working with. That makes all the difference. This is also why children learn so effectively. They are constantly predicting, testing, failing, adjusting, and trying again. They do not need formal explanations first. Their brains are learning through contact and correction. Adults can do the same thing, but only if they stop treating language like a school subject and start treating it like a living system. So the central idea of this section is clear. Fluency does not grow from memorizing more explanations. It grows from building intuition. And intuition is built when the brain is forced to notice patterns, make predictions, test them, and adjust. That is how language becomes usable. That is how knowledge turns into ability. Once you understand that language is learned through prediction rather than memorization, the next breakthrough becomes much easier to see. Learning a language is not mainly about collecting translations. It is about discovering how that language organizes reality. This is where many learners get stuck without even realizing it. They study word pairs, they memorize sentence equivalents, they build mental bridges from the new language back into their own. At first, this feels useful because translation gives a quick sense of control. You see a phrase in Spanish, French, or Japanese, and you match it to a phrase in English. Problem solved, or so it seems. But the deeper truth is that translation is only a temporary support. It is not the language itself. Every language has its own inner logic. It has its own habits, patterns, priorities, and ways of framing experience. Two languages may describe the same event, but they often do not build that meaning in the same way. This matters much more than most learners think, because if you only memorize what a sentence equals in your native language, you may know the answer on paper, but you still may not understand how the target language is actually thinking. Take a simple example. In English, we say, "I am cold." In Spanish, the phrase is tengo frío, which more literally means, "I have cold." Both expressions point to the same human experience, but they structure that experience differently. English treats cold as a state of being. Spanish treats it more like something possessed or experienced. That is not just a different phrase, it is a different conceptual pattern. And that is exactly what traditional study often hides. When a learner memorizes that tengo frío means "I am cold," they feel as if they have learned something important. But in reality, they may have learned only a translation shortcut. They know the correspondence, but they do not yet feel the pattern underneath it. They have the bridge, but they have not crossed it. Real progress begins when the brain starts noticing these deeper regularities. Imagine encountering tengo frío inside a real sentence. You already know that tengo has something to do with "I have." Maybe you recognize frío from another context related to winter or temperature, so you make a guess. "I have cold." Maybe that means "I feel cold." Then you check the meaning and discover that you are right. That moment is more powerful than it looks. Why? Because your brain has done more than attach one phrase to one translation. It has begun to detect how the language behaves. It starts building an internal expectation. Perhaps this language expresses bodily states or internal conditions through possession rather than identity. Now, when you later see Tango Hombre, your brain is not starting from zero. It already has a working hypothesis. If cold can be something you have, perhaps hunger works the same way. You guess, you check, and once again the pattern strengthens. This is how intuition forms, not through isolated facts, but through repeated encounters with meaningful structure. That is the real difference between vocabulary learning and language learning. Vocabulary by itself is a list. Language is a system. A list can be memorized. A system must be explored. It must be felt through examples, tension, prediction, and repeated contact. When learners fail to make this shift, they often end up with a strange kind of knowledge. They know many words, but they cannot move with them. They can recognize grammar explanations, but they cannot build meaning with confidence. They may even understand a sentence after translating it, yet still feel lost when they try to speak. That happens because they have learned the language as information, not as an operating system. The purpose of this method is to change that. Instead of always asking, "What does this mean in English?" the learner begins asking a better question. How is this language trying to express this idea? That question turns passive study into active discovery. It shifts the focus away from substitution and towards structure. It helps the learner stop depending on literal translation and start sensing how the language itself organizes experience. This becomes even more powerful when you add the next step. After reading and checking your understanding, explain the idea back to yourself out loud in the target language. Not by copying the exact sentence, not by reciting mechanically, but by rephrasing the idea in your own words. This is where shallow understanding breaks apart and deeper understanding begins. When you only read or listen, it is easy to believe you understand more than you really do. Recognition creates an illusion of mastery. You see familiar words, the sentence seems understandable, and your brain relaxes. But when you try to explain the same idea yourself, everything changes. Suddenly you must choose words, you must build structure, you must decide,